Castaway's Banner, written by Silas Jackson and Abigail Drake. Read by Devra Mattes. Act 1. The Godless Paladin. The light that shines through throws no shadow on the snow. Its fuel is itself. Chapter 2. The girl sat upright, keeping the furs draped around her slim shoulders, clasped with one hand at her chest. Awake now, she seemed to be becoming more aware of the frigid cold by the second, as if some subtle bubble of warmth was dwindling away from her. Lestara furrowed her brow, crouching in front of the sitting girl to meet her eye. "How did you do that?" The girl shook her head. "I didn't do anything." "You activated the pillar." "I didn't," the girl said softly, fumbling for words as if she barely understood what she was saying. "It manifested me." Lestara rocked back on her heels and stood. She glanced towards Caven. She said nothing, but the subtext was clear in her exhausted face. I think her mind was fried by whatever just occurred. "It's so cold," the girl said, pulling the furs tighter around herself. "We need to get clothes for her," Caven said, nudging Lestara. Again, they did not speak the subtext aloud. "We won't find out what happened here if she freezes to death." Fortunately, one of the skirmishers had been a woman similar in size to the girl, so the heavy outer garments, fur hat, and boots fit her tolerably well. As the girl shrugged the tunic on, no one mentioned the hole near the collarbone left by Caven's spear, or the grisly discoloration around it. It did not change the fact that the garment was warm and necessary. Lestara stepped back to look the girl up and down when she was dressed. After a pause, Lestara hooded her eyes, swaying on her feet. Caven reached for her, snapping her awake, steadying her. "Thanks," she said, voice faint. She made a rasping sound in her throat. Caven remained close, as if expecting her to sway again, ready to catch her. The girl stepped forward. "You're weak with hunger," she said, deep concern clear to see on her delicate features. She looked at Caven, staring into his face. Caven straightened up, shoulders squared, suddenly feeling as if his mask wasn't there. "You both are." "Our unit has been pinned in place for a while," Lestara croaked. Her knees buckled, and Caven caught her as she dropped towards the ground. Thresher laid gnarled hands on the ashwood railing, carved in a writhen pattern like entwined vines, and gazed over the bowed heads of his congregation, waiting below his pulpit in mute expectation. He tilted his head and drew a slow breath. "For prior generations," he said, his sonorous voice carrying into the silent hall, "the old world was vibrant and alive. It was not the ruins we see on our tattered horizon. Their technologies in those days were not relics for the elevated to keep in their dusty tabernacles. But when the vagabonds came, the technologies of the old worlders did not avail them." He paused. The stone walls and pillars buzzed with dying echoes and trailed into silence. A slight cough broke the absolute stillness of his congregation. Then all was quiet again. The thresher raised his voice. "Their sacrilege of seeking transcendence for mankind through the material at the expense of the spiritual, while deserving of our scorn, yes, became also pitiful. Benighted technologists encroached on the ground sovereign to heaven, and they were rewarded as they had earned. We can pity those lost souls, for they were cursed to live and die before our hallowed saviors blazed the true way. And further I tell you, my children, that the vagabonds, too, were driven by desperation of the flesh, by dissolution of the material. That is why they fled the husk of a dead planet behind them, and darkened the old worlders' skies. They were chasing an empty prophecy which said that salvation was to be found in a new world. Fools will hear this and learn nothing, but to the wise it is a teaching. It shows the folly of trusting prophets who peddle salvation in a new world. There are iconoclasts amongst us who spew false, empty rhetoric to beguiled followers, claiming mankind's salvation lies in renewing this world. They wish, dearly, to perpetuate the agony of our purgatory and forestall the ultimate release into a better existence. I tell you, my children, this world is not dying. It is dead. We are insects teeming on its corpse. Release from this life into something greater is the only end sought by the wise. The Thraves' teaching are the sole road to a better recompense for life than the world can offer us. Timid at first, out of sync, a few in the congregation murmured, "Hail the Thrave." Thresher Valadin smiled and lifted his hands. The emboldened congregation as one thundered, "Hail the Thrave!" As Lestara's eyes opened, she saw Caven's face above her. His mask was off. The rippled burn scar over the whole left side of his face was faintly visible in the light of stars bouncing from the snowy ground. "How are you?" Caven asked, voice flat, none of his obvious worry coming through in his tone. "I'm great," Lestara said, straining for a wry smile. She tightened her stomach and sat up, bracing herself on her elbows. Sluggishly, as she gauged herself, she realized she actually did feel better than she had before. What happened? Caven raised his eyebrows slightly, the movement almost invisible in the dim light. "I have no idea." He raised his head, nodding towards the girl in the skirmisher's garments and furs standing close by, against a backdrop of evergreens. Eyes busy roving around the treetops and the starry sky above, the girl was slow to notice Lestara was awake. When she glanced towards the war fighters and saw them watching her, she broke into a wide smile. "Hello." Caven leaned towards Lestara, whispering to her conspiratorially. "She helped you, I think. Caven laid a hand softly on Lestara's abdomen, unable to offer any more clarity about what the girl had done. He withdrew his hand and shrugged. Lestara chewed her lip. "You helped me?" Lestara asked, glancing away from Caven at the girl. "How?" The girl mimed placing her palms on something. She grimaced in thought. "I'm not sure. I wanted you to feel better." Lestara's chapped lips parted as she gave the girl a lingering, puzzled look. "Well, thank you," she said. She motioned Caven to give her space and got to her feet. The girl moved towards Lestara and Caven, eyes alert, a placid smile hovering on her lips. Without the goggles washing away colors in exchange for acute night vision, Caven could faintly see by starlight that the girl's eyes were the blue of forget-me-nots, and her braids, protruding below the fur brim of her hat, were a shade of brown-yellow, like honey. "I don't understand any of this," Lestara said, crossing her arms. "But I do know nothing which has happened changes the fact that our unit is trapped back there in the ravine." She turned to Caven. "We need to return to them." Caven nodded. "What about her?" He gestured at the girl. Lestara uncrossed her arms, considering the question. "You are still weak," the girl said, reaching for Lestara. She took the warfighter's hand. Surprised by the action, Lestara flinched, but did not draw away. She briefly groped for something to say. "Do you have a name?" Lestara asked finally, voice soft. The girl shook her head. "Then I'll call you Mimi," Lestara said. She smiled. "It means sweet where I was born. Years ago, my son used to call every type of fruit the same thing, Mimi." In the season plants fruited, he would ask for... She paused. A tear had beaded at the reddened rim of her eye, then carved a course down her dusty cheek, startling her into silence. She raised her left hand, wiping at damp eyes. I haven't talked about him in so long. What is happening? Mimi held on to Lestara's right hand, saying nothing. The women gazed at each other, one taller and more weathered, one shorter and somehow as fresh as the snow lying upon the understory around them, like she had been newly born at the moment they found her curled beneath the pillar in the frozen dirt. They held still. Except for puffs of steam as they breathed, nothing amongst the starlit trees moved. Caven watched, jaw slack, as the elastic moments of silence stretched past. Something formed between Mimi and Lestara, ineffable but unmistakable. Like nighttime stars hidden behind the blue of the daylight sky, Caven knew it was real, but he could not see it. He stood back, eyes fixed on what was happening before him, saying nothing. Lestara cleared her throat. We should start towards the ravine. Mimi, what will you do? Will you come with us? Mimi nodded. I think so. I don't know where I'm supposed to be. She glanced at Caven, and she trailed off. Yes, I'll go with you. As they stepped into the light of torches and watchfires, Caven, Lestara, and Mimi drew the eyes of tired, haggard warfighters strewn around the rocks, clothes unkempt, faces chalky with cold and caked on dust. With an effort, the nearest warfighter rose to his feet, saluting Lestara. Welcome back, Commander. Lestara nodded in acknowledgement, foregoing the formal salute. She grimaced. We don't have good news. The warfighter winced, face dropping. As we feared. But who is this? He gestured at Mimi, as a few other exhausted-looking warfighters drifted closer to the sound of the voices. Her name is Mimi, Lestara said. She briefly recapped her and Caven's encounter with the well-armed patrol group, and Mimi's inexplicable intervention through somehow awakening a power inside a pillar, which saved their lives. Despite their bone weariness, the warfighters conjured the nervous energy to look amazed as they listened. We don't know, Lestara finished, where she came from. Mimi pursed her lips, unwilling or unable to add any more information than Lestara had already laid out. So, a harsh voice, gravelly with thirst, called, you're telling us you have no plan. A tall figure emerged through the opposite end of the campfire's light, pushing from somewhere farther into the makeshift encampment. The firelight danced upon hanging braids of blonde hair, framing a chiseled face, a braided beard down his chin. Though he was dressed in a mantle of furs like Caven's, the similarities in the men's appearances ended there. The soldier now speaking was handsome. Despite where they were, his leather armor and metal baubles looked brightly polished in the firelight, everything intricate and artisanal. Nakata, Lestara said, you are right. I'm telling you that we need a new idea of how to get out of here. Nakata crossed his arms. You led us into this trap, and you have no idea how to get us out. Perhaps what we need is a new leader. He uncrossed his arms and took a step towards Lestara, shoulders squared to her. Without a word, Caven brushed past Lestara and placed the implacable wall of his body between her and the advancing Nakata, half a head above him, mask underlit by fire, lenses glinting. Nakata shrank back instantaneously, like a paper doll hit by a rush of water. Caven made no sound but the crackling rasp of slow breath through his mask's respirator. Catching himself and regaining his composure, Nakata again folded his arms. What do you propose to do now, Commander? Nakata growled, eyes fixed on Caven but addressing Lestara behind him. Lestara stepped forward, nudging Caven gently, regaining line of sight to Nakata. She drew her muffler down from her face. You are right that I led us into this trap. Fighting our way out is a desperate move. In daylight, it was certain death, but perhaps in darkness. Our enemies outgun and outnumber us, and they hold high ground, Nakata said. Lestara chewed her lip. As I said, it is a desperate attempt, but I cannot see what else to do. Perhaps, Nakata said, before we try anything, we can lessen the enemy's advantage. Lestara raised her eyebrows. How? What is your idea? Nakata pointed at Mimi, revealing for the first time that he had heard what Lestara said about her. You say she activated a pillar somehow, and the pulse of energy disabled guns and machines all around, letting you overwhelm the surprised, disarmed enemy even though they pointed rifles at you. We can do the same on a larger scale. We know the enemy camp on the rim above is set near at least one pillar. We have seen it. If she could be sneaked into the camp and unleash a pulse which strips our foes of their war machines and ranged weapons, it would wash away much of the dominance they hold. Mimi's jaw fell. She glanced at Lestara with a stunned face, waiting for her to reply. Caven raised his hand, rubbing his chin beneath his mask, grunting softly to himself. Nakata is not wrong, he reflected. Pride and priggishness aside, he can occasionally think. Lestara turned narrowed eyes towards Mimi. She opened her mouth twice to speak before deciding on words. That would be dangerous. But with so many lives at stake, would you do it? Mimi furrowed her brow, meeting Lestara's eye, then turned her gaze to the human and animal wreckage visible scattered in the light of watchfires. Some warfighters unsteady on their feet, others too incapacitated by hunger, thirst, and cold to stand at all. At the edge of the firelight, a lump amid the rocks showed the low, labored breathing of a famished horse. Mimi shivered in a gust of cold wind, passing through the ravine, making the fire shimmer, shifting a few meager scraps of woody shrubs they were burning, and setting cinders afloat into the night. I will do it, she said finally. It took very little discussion to decide stealth trumped everything in a mission such as this one. It was better if Mimi went with only a small contingent of bodyguards, allowing her to sneak into the enemy camp unnoticed and vanish into the night during the chaos afterwards, without being involved in any fighting. And Mimi could not have a smaller bodyguard contingent than a lone warrior. One, worth 6 or more. So with only brief deliberation, Lestara ordered Caven and Caven alone to accompany Mimi back through the ravine the way they had just come. From the slope, they could access the woodland above, and loop the long way around the enemy camp to access it from the rear, the direction the mercenaries would least expect an incursion and might be most lax in keeping a lookout. Before they left the desperate scene of the fire-lit encampment behind them, with half-frozen, more than half-starved soldiers hunched by crackling fires or nestled against shaggy horses for warmth, Caven fished in his outer garments for something on a chain around his neck. He found it and drew it from the folds, wrapped in his gloved fingers. Mimi watched, eyes fixed on the masked titan of a man, staring at Lestara, a bit of chain drooping from either side of his closed hand. I vow to you I will see this task completed, Caven said flatly. Lestara held the gaze of the mask. Mimi shivered, as if another gust of wind had moved through the canyon. Blinking, she realized what she was feeling was something else. It was profound. It was a swell in music, but it made no sound. It was the pang of a thought she couldn't name. Something with substance had been said. She wanted to understand it, but Caven dropped the object and the chain back into his garments, too quick and direct for Mimi to catch a glimpse of what it was. Lestara nodded, aware also that there was something hard but not brittle, and unyielding but not breakable in Caven's vow to her. She gestured for Caven and Mimi to go. As the pair picked their way again through darkness, hugging the wall of the ravine, Caven felt better to be acting on a definite plan than a vague hope. He could almost forget how hungry he was, the dull ache driven from his mind by his focus on the task at hand. The burning thirst was harder to ignore. Caven watched constantly for dangers farther down the ravine, or on the walls around. He had no reason to expect any. If nothing else, the standoff had made it obvious that the garrison above was content to let their enemies below die quietly. And why wouldn't they be, if the mercenaries can bide their time and allow 100 or so dangerous antagonists to wither away? It would be foolish to expose themselves to danger by forcing a confrontation with trapped foes who will fight with everything they have. Nonetheless, from habit, he constantly expected disaster and remained alert for signs of it. Hustling along behind, Mimi thumped into Caven's back as he suddenly stopped moving. "Here," Caven said, gesturing in the darkness towards the scree. They had reached the point where the ravine opened out, roughly a mile from where the garrison was encamped above, all going well, more than enough of a buffer to loop around through the woodland unseen. Mimi nodded slowly, staring up the steep declivity along the rubble, a tiny movement Caven could only catch thanks to night vision, so he got the impression Mimi was reassuring herself, not him. They started up the shifting, precarious rocks, stepping lightly, Caven feeling along with the butt of his spear. For a while, they picked their way in silence, too intent on the climb to speak. "Caven," Mimi said softly, breaking the quiet, "what if we cross another patrol?" "Now that we know to expect them on the rim," Caven said, "we will dart away from the side of the ravine as fast as possible and double back overland instead. We should be fine." Mimi dropped her eyes again, careful of her footing as they went. "We should be," she murmured. "Caven?" "What?" He paused, looking over his shoulder at Mimi behind and below him, following. "What are the pillars?" Caven's empty stomach fell. She has no idea what she's doing. She doesn't know what she did to activate the previous one and disable the enemy weapons. For all that, it may have been merely coincidental that the pillar came alive moments before we found her there. She might have been lying naked on the frozen ground for other reasons, or no reason. He took a slow breath. Nobody knows. They have always been in this land, rising from the ground like fingers. They are wrought of some unrecognizable metal, so perhaps they were made by people who lived and died here long ago. It is possible they were understood once, but they are a mystery now. Mimi nodded thoughtfully, eyes unfocused as they lightly scanned over her footing. They weren't made by people. Caven paused in his tracks again. He glanced back, looking at Mimi briefly before speaking. "What?" Mimi shook herself and frowned. "I don't know." Caven shrugged and turned away. He unslung his canteen, fitting it to a valve in the respirator of his mask, to take a small sip of the precious bit of water they'd been able to obtain by melting ice in the ravine. He flinched as he heard Mimi shout behind him. Whirling around, he saw her losing her footing. Reaching to grab her lapel on sheer reflex, he saved her from sliding down the scree amongst some dislodged stones. She slowly regained control of herself, releasing her two-handed grip on Caven's wrist, catching her breath. Caven glanced at the canteen he'd dropped while catching Mimi. In crisp black and white, he saw the last bit of water drip from the spout and vanish amidst parched rocks. Mimi joined him, staring down at the dropped canteen. "Sorry," she said. Caven grunted. "It's no surprise. We get what we deserve." He spoke the words like a benediction.